Imagine waking up one morning to find that the entire shape of the world had changed overnight. The coastlines you knew were gone, swallowed by rising seas. Islands vanished beneath the waves. Entire landscapes were carved apart by walls of water so massive they make modern tsunamis look like ripples in a bathtub. Sounds like a disaster movie, right? Except it actually happened. And it happened around 12,000 years ago, during an event so catastrophic that every culture on Earth still remembers it. Here's something that should blow your mind. Over 200 ancient civilizations, spread across every continent, have stories about a great flood. The Mesopotamians had Gilgamesh, the Hebrews had Noah, the Greeks had Deucalion, the Chinese had Gun Yu, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Australian Aboriginals, isolated island cultures in the Pacific, all of them, all telling essentially the same story, a massive flood that nearly destroyed the world. For thousands of years, scholars dismissed these as myths, just primitive attempts to explain natural disasters. But what if they weren't myths? What if they were memories? Distorted by time, wrapped in religious meaning, passed down through countless generations, but at their core, memories of something real. Something that actually happened. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's wild. Sydney at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, London during lunch break, all at once. It's like the whole world gathering round one campfire. The story we're about to explore isn't just about water. It's about the end of the last ice age, about a period geologists call the Younger Dryas, when Earth's climate went haywire. It's about ice sheets the size of continents collapsing in geological heartbeats. It's about enough meltwater being released to raise global sea levels by hundreds of feet. And it's about how this catastrophic flooding might have fundamentally changed human civilization forever, pushing our ancestors from nomadic hunters into settled farmers, from scattered tribes into organized societies. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. Massive scars carved into bedrock, gigantic boulders transported hundreds of miles by unimaginable currents, underwater structures that used to be dry land, marine fossils found thousands of feet above current sea levels, and most intriguingly, a sudden, mysterious leap in human development that happened right around the time these floods would have occurred. The birth of agriculture, the first cities, the beginning of what we call civilization. All of it emerging from the chaos of a world being reshaped by water. See, for most of human history, we were doing just fine as hunter-gatherers. For hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in small groups, following animals, collecting plants, moving with the seasons. There was no need to settle down, no need to farm, no need to build permanent structures. Then, around 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Suddenly, humans in multiple locations around the world, places with no contact with each other, all independently decided to start planting crops, domesticating animals, building villages. Why? What happened to make the old way of life impossible? What forced humanity to fundamentally reinvent itself? The answer might be hidden in those flood stories, in the geological evidence of rapid sea level rise, in the climate records trapped in ice cores and ocean sediments, in the mysterious megafloods that carved landscapes in days or weeks that should have taken millions of years to form. Tonight, we're going on a journey through deep time. We'll walk across the frozen world of the Ice Age, meet the megafauna that vanished when the ice melted, explore the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions that shouldn't have happened. We'll watch ice sheets collapse and witness floods so massive they dwarf anything in recorded history. We'll examine the hard evidence, the geology, the physics, the undeniable proof that our planet went through an aquatic apocalypse, and we'll see how ancient cultures around the world encoded these catastrophic events into their most sacred stories. Most importantly, we'll understand how this great flood, this planetary transformation, created the world we live in today, how it shaped our coastlines, influenced our myths, and possibly triggered the birth of civilization itself. Because here's the thing, we're not just descendants of the survivors of that ancient bottleneck 900,000 years ago. We're also descendants of the survivors of the Great Melt, the people who watched their world drown and somehow adapted, evolved, and built something new from the wreckage. So get comfortable, let the day fade away, and let's explore the great flood that changed the world 12,000 years ago. Picture Earth 20,000 years ago. Not the Earth you know, not green continents separated by blue oceans, but something stranger, something colder, something that would seem utterly alien if you could somehow travel back and witness it. Welcome to the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, when our planet transformed into something that looked more like another world entirely. Start in the north. Where New York City stands today, there's nothing but ice. Not just snow, not winter frost, but a wall of solid ice nearly 2 miles thick. Imagine that. 2 miles of frozen water compressed under its own weight into a mass so enormous it literally pushed the Earth's crust down into the mantle beneath. This is the Laurentide ice sheet, and it doesn't just cover New York. It extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains, from the Arctic down to what's now Ohio and Pennsylvania. Everything buried. Chicago, Toronto, Montreal, all under miles of permanent ice. If you stood at the southern edge of this frozen monster and looked north, you'd see a wall of white stretching to the horizon and beyond, cliffs of ice carving off massive chunks that would crash down with sounds like thunder. The Cordilleran ice sheet covers the entire Pacific Northwest, burying the future sites of Seattle and Vancouver under glaciers that grind slowly toward the sea. These two massive ice sheets occasionally merge, creating a continuous frozen barrier from coast to coast. North America has essentially ceased to exist as a habitable continent. It's been replaced by Antarctica. Cross the Atlantic and the story's the same. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covers all of Scandinavia, Finland, and extends down across the Baltic states into northern Poland and Germany. Britain and Ireland vanish beneath glaciers. The Alps become a frozen fortress of ice sheets and mountain glaciers, merging into one massive complex. Even the valleys that millions of tourists visit today to see glacial remnants are completely entombed in ice hundreds of meters thick. Asia gets the same treatment. The Siberian ice sheet sprawls across northern Russia. Mountain glaciers in the Himalayas expand dramatically, creating rivers of ice dozens of miles long. Even in the south, in what will become temperate zones, the climate is harsh, cold, nothing like the mild weather those regions enjoy today. But here's where it gets really interesting. All that ice has to come from somewhere, and where it comes from is the ocean. Water that would normally be liquid in the seas gets locked up in ice on land. For thousands of years the cycle continues. Snow falls on the ice sheets, compresses into more ice, and the ice sheets grow thicker and spread wider. The ocean gets robbed, drop by drop, storm by storm, year by year. Sea levels fall, not a little, not a few feet, 400 feet. In some places more. 400 feet of vertical sea level change exposes continental shelves that have been underwater for tens of thousands of years. Suddenly, vast new territories emerge from the waves. Land bridges connect continents. Islands become peninsulas. The map of Earth fundamentally changes. Between Siberia and Alaska, a land bridge emerges that's not just a narrow strip, it's a subcontinent. Beringia, as scientists call it, is nearly 1,000 miles wide at its maximum extent, a vast grassland connecting Asia and North America. This isn't some tenuous connection you could barely walk across. This is a migration highway, a new territory, an entire ecosystem that will become crucial to human expansion into the Americas. In what will become the North Sea, another massive land bridge emerges. Doggerland, connecting Britain to continental Europe, isn't a bridge at all, really. It's a country. Rivers flow across it, draining the meltwaters from the ice sheets to the north. Forests grow, animals migrate across it, and humans will build communities. Here, living on land that doesn't exist anymore, that got swallowed by the sea when the Ice Age ended. All around the world, these new territories emerge. Indonesia connects to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania merge into a single continent called Sahul. The Persian Gulf dries up completely, becoming a river valley. The Mediterranean coastline extends miles beyond where it is today, and on these exposed shelves, on these new lands that have arisen from the sea, life explodes. The megafauna of the Ice Age weren't just big versions of modern animals, they were something else entirely. Woolly mammoths, standing 13 feet tall at the shoulder, roamed in herds across the grasslands of North America, Europe, and Asia. Their curved tusks, some reaching 15 feet in length, were used to sweep snow aside to reach the vegetation beneath. They were perfectly adapted to the cold, with tiny ears to prevent heat loss, small tails, and that famous shaggy coat that could be 10 inches thick. But mammoths were just the beginning. Mastodons, slightly smaller but equally impressive, browsed the forests of North America. Giant ground sloths, some species weighing 4 tons and standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, fed on trees across South America and the southern reaches of North America. Imagine a sloth the size of an elephant, moving in slow motion through forests that no longer exist. Saber-toothed cats, the famous Smilodon, prowled these Ice Age landscapes with canine teeth that could reach 7 inches long. They weren't just bigger versions of modern big cats. Their entire hunting strategy was different, adapted to take down megafauna with those massive stabbing teeth, probably targeting the throat and belly of prey too large for other predators to handle efficiently. Giant short-faced bears, larger than any bear alive today, dominated the predator hierarchy in North America. Standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, they could run faster than modern bears and probably scavenged or stole kills from other predators as much as they hunted themselves. Dire wolves, 25% larger than modern grey wolves, hunted in packs across the Americas. Cave lions, larger than any modern lion, ranged across Europe and Asia. Giant beavers the size of modern black bears built dams in North American rivers. Glyptodons, armoured mammals that looked like Volkswagen Beetles with tails, lumbered across South American grasslands. This wasn't just a colder version of today's world. This was a fundamentally different planet populated by creatures that seem almost mythological to us now. And into this world of giants and ice came humans. By 20,000 years ago, modern humans had already spread from Africa across much of the ice-free world. But they weren't the sophisticated city builders of later eras. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following animal migrations, adapting to environments that would kill modern humans in days without the right knowledge and technology. But they were adapting brilliantly. The humans of the last glacial maximum weren't primitive. They were incredibly sophisticated, with survival skills refined over thousands of generations of living in marginal environments. They had developed cold weather clothing that wouldn't be surpassed in efficiency until modern synthetic materials. Layered garments made from animal skins, carefully stitched with bone needles and sinew thread. Fur-lined boots and gloves. Hooded parkas that could keep a person alive through Arctic winters. Their stone tool technology had reached remarkable levels of refinement. The careful flaking of stone to create perfectly symmetrical spear points and knife blades. The hafting of these tools onto wooden or bone handles using plant resins and animal glue. The development of specialized tools for specific tasks. Hide scrapers, bone awls, engraving tools for decorating objects. More impressively, they had mastered fire not just as a tool for warmth and cooking, but as a sophisticated technology. They knew which materials burned hottest, which produced the least smoke for indoor fires, how to maintain fires for days or weeks without letting them go out. They had learned to use fire to harden wooden spears, to crack rocks for easier tool making, possibly even to manage landscapes by controlled burning. Their hunting strategies showed remarkable intelligence and cooperation. These weren't opportunistic scavengers hoping to find dead animals. These were systematic hunters who could track prey for days, coordinate group attacks on dangerous megafauna, and use sophisticated tactics like driving animals off cliffs or into dead-end canyons. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of mammoth hunting camps where dozens of animals were processed. This required not just successful hunting but also complex social organization to distribute meat, preserve it for later use, and ensure the whole group benefited from risky hunts. They were also creating art, not just practical tools but objects of beauty. Cave paintings in Europe show sophisticated understanding of proportion, movement, and even perspective. Carved figurines, some remarkably detailed, show they were thinking abstractly, creating representations of the world around them, and they were spreading. Despite the ice, despite the cold, despite environments that seemed utterly inhospitable, humans kept expanding into new territories. Some groups pushed into the coldest regions of Siberia, developing the skills that would eventually let them cross Beringia into the Americas. Others adapted to life in Ice Age Europe, creating some of the richest archaeological sites we've ever found. But they were all living on a planet in transition, because by 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum was at its peak, and peaks don't last forever. The Earth's orbit, its tilt, the complex cycles that drive ice ages, all these factors were beginning to shift. More sunlight was reaching the northern hemisphere during summer. Not much more, but enough. The great ice sheets, which had seemed permanent, eternal, immovable, were about to start their retreat. Around 19,000 years ago, the first signs appeared. Slightly warmer summers, ice beginning to retreat at the margins of the great sheets, rivers of meltwater starting to flow across the newly exposed land. And then, around 14,700 years ago, something changed dramatically. The warming accelerated, not gradually, not slowly, but in what geologists call the Berling-Allerud interstadial, a period of rapid warming that sent temperatures soaring. The Ice Age, it seemed, was ending. The great melt was beginning. Within a few thousand years, those massive ice sheets would retreat hundreds of miles. Sea levels would begin their inexorable rise. The megafauna would face new pressures as their frozen grasslands transformed into forests. And humans, those adaptable survivors who had learned to thrive in the coldest conditions, would face a new challenge. Not how to survive the ice, but how to survive its absence. How to adapt when everything they'd known, every strategy they'd developed, every territory they'd claimed was about to be transformed by water. The stage was set for the greatest environmental transformation in human history. The Ice Age Earth was about to become something else entirely, and nothing would ever be the same again. Picture this. It's 12,900 years ago. For the past 7,000 years, the world has been steadily warming. The massive ice sheets that covered North America and Europe have been retreating. Glaciers that were once miles thick are melting back, revealing land that hasn't seen sunlight in 100,000 years. Sea levels are rising, forests are spreading, and animal populations are exploding. Your ancestors, who had survived the brutal conditions of the last glacial maximum, are thriving. Food is becoming more abundant, the climate is getting more predictable. Some groups have even started settling in one place instead of constantly moving, building permanent camps near reliable water sources. Everything is improving. The future looks bright. And then, almost overnight, the world breaks. Within a single human lifetime, maybe faster, temperatures across the northern hemisphere collapse. Not gradually, not slowly, but catastrophically. The warming trend that had been transforming the planet for millennia just stops, and then reverses. Hard. This is the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower called Dryas octopetala that suddenly starts appearing in places it shouldn't. In layers of ancient sediment and ice cores, this flower shows up as a marker of cold times, times when Arctic conditions returned to regions that had already begun warming. But calling it a return to cold doesn't capture the scale of what happened. This wasn't just a cold snap or a bad winter. This was a climate catastrophe that plunged the northern hemisphere back into near glacial conditions in what some evidence suggests was less than a decade, maybe less than 3 years. Some ice core data from Greenland suggests temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Celsius in a single year. Think about that for a second. A 15 degrees Celsius drop in average temperature. Not in one place, but across entire continents. That's the difference between New York City and northern Alaska. Except it happened everywhere at once. And it happened so fast that ecosystems had no time to adapt. In Greenland, the ice cores tell the story with startling clarity. You can see it in the annual layers of ice, each one representing a single year's snowfall. The ratio of oxygen isotopes changes dramatically, showing that temperatures plummeted and precipitation patterns shifted almost instantly. Animals that had been migrating north into newly opened territories suddenly found those territories buried under snow and ice again. Plants that had been spreading into warming regions died back as killing frosts returned to areas that hadn't seen them in centuries. Your ancestors, who had been cautiously optimistic about the improving conditions, suddenly found themselves back in survival mode. Rivers that had been reliable water sources froze solid. Game animals that had become abundant started dying off or migrating away from regions that could no longer support them. Groups that had begun experimenting with sedentary living, staying in one place year-round, had to become nomadic again, following increasingly scarce resources across landscapes that were rapidly becoming hostile. The Younger Dryas lasted roughly 1,300 years. 1,300 years of cold, of harsh winters and short summers, of ecological disruption and resource scarcity. But here's what makes it truly terrifying. It wasn't supposed to happen. The warming trend should have continued. The ice sheets were already in full retreat. The orbital mechanics that had triggered the end of the Ice Age hadn't changed. By all rights, the planet should have kept warming. So what the hell happened? This is where things get controversial. Scientists have been debating the cause of the Younger Dryas for decades, and they still don't fully agree. There are several theories, each supported by different types of evidence, and understanding them means understanding how fragile our climate really is. The mainstream theory, the one most climate scientists accept, involves the massive ice sheets covering North America. The Laurentide ice sheet, which at its peak was 2 miles thick and covered most of Canada and the northern United States, had been melting for thousands of years. All that meltwater had to go somewhere. Initially, it drained south through the Mississippi River system into the Gulf of Mexico. But around 12,900 years ago, something changed. As the ice sheet continued melting, new drainage pathways opened up. Suddenly, enormous volumes of fresh water that had been flowing south started flowing east instead, pouring into the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence River. We're not talking about normal river flow here. We're talking about volumes that would make the Amazon look like a creek. Millions of cubic meters per second, maybe more, dumping into the North Atlantic Ocean. Now here's why that matters. The North Atlantic is home to one of the planet's most important climate systems, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, sometimes called the Ocean Conveyor Belt. Warm, salty water flows north from the tropics. When it reaches the Arctic, it cools, becomes denser because of its high salt content, and sinks. This sinking drives a massive current system that redistributes heat around the planet. It's why Europe is habitable despite being at the same latitude as northern Canada. But the system depends on salinity. It needs the water to be salty enough to sink when it cools. Dump millions of cubic meters of fresh water into it, and suddenly the water becomes too fresh, too light. It stops sinking. The entire circulation system slows down or shuts off completely. When that happened, 12,900 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere lost one of its primary heat distribution mechanisms. Europe and North America, which had been warming nicely, suddenly found themselves cut off from the tropical heat that had been moderating their climates. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating started advancing again. The Younger Dryas had begun. This theory is elegant, well supported by oceanographic evidence, and explains most of the observations, but it's not the only theory. And this is where things get really interesting and really controversial. In 2007, a team of researchers proposed something radical. What if the Younger Dryas wasn't triggered by ocean circulation changes at all? What if it was caused by an extraterrestrial impact? Not a massive asteroid that created a crater, but something more insidious. A cosmic airburst or multiple airbursts from a fragmenting comet that exploded in the atmosphere over North America. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it's been one of the most contentious debates in recent scientific history. The researchers claim to have found evidence of impact markers in sediment layers dating to exactly 12,900 years ago. Microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, which can form under extreme pressure and temperature. Magnetic spherules, tiny beads of iron that form when rocks are subjected to intense heat. Carbon spherules indicating massive wildfires. Platinum anomalies suggesting extraterrestrial material, and most controversially, a thin black layer of sediment enriched with carbon and exotic materials found at dozens of sites across North America and Europe. The theory goes like this. A comet, probably a fragment from a much larger body, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded above the Laurentide ice sheet. The explosion was powerful enough to cause widespread destruction across North America. Massive wildfires that would have lit up the entire continent, shock waves that flattened forests, and critically, enough energy deposited onto the ice sheet to trigger catastrophic melting. According to this hypothesis, the impact melted enormous quantities of ice almost instantly. This sudden deluge of meltwater would have poured into the oceans, disrupting the Atlantic circulation system. But it would also have thrown massive amounts of dust and aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid cooling. A double whammy that plunged the Northern Hemisphere into a climate crisis. The impact theory is appealing because it explains some puzzling features of the Younger Dryas. The rapidity of onset, the evidence of massive wildfires at exactly the right time, the extinction of numerous large mammals in North America, including mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats, all within a very narrow time window. And intriguingly, the apparent collapse of the Clovis culture, one of the earliest widespread human cultures in North America, which seems to disappear from the archaeological record right at the start of the Younger Dryas. But the impact hypothesis has fierce critics. Many researchers argue that the supposed impact markers can be explained by normal processes. Nanodiamonds can form in wildfires. Magnetic spherules are common in certain types of sediment. The platinum anomaly isn't consistent across sites, and no impact crater has ever been found, though proponents argue the impactor hit the ice sheet and therefore left no crater. The debate has been intense, sometimes bitter. Papers are published supporting the impact hypothesis. Other papers are published refuting them. Evidence is presented, criticized, defended, and argued over at scientific conferences. As of now, the scientific community remains divided, though the mainstream position is still that ocean circulation changes, not cosmic impacts, triggered the Younger Dryas. But here's what's not controversial. Whatever caused it, the Younger Dryas was a catastrophe for the Northern Hemisphere. For the megafauna that had survived the worst of the Ice Age, it was the final blow. Mammoths and mastodons that had already been stressed by climate change and human hunting faced another 1,300 years of harsh conditions. They didn't make it. By the time the Younger Dryas ended, most of the large Ice Age mammals were extinct. For humans, the Younger Dryas was a different kind of challenge. We were adaptable enough to survive, but we couldn't survive without changing. Groups that had been experimenting with sedentary living had to become mobile again. Populations that had been growing had to contract. Technologies that worked in warming conditions had to be abandoned or modified for a world that had suddenly become cold again. In the Middle East, something remarkable happened. Groups that had been harvesting wild grains found that their food sources were becoming unreliable as the climate shifted. Some researchers think this pressure might have pushed them toward the earliest experiments in cultivation, actively planting and tending wild grains instead of just harvesting them. The first tentative steps toward agriculture, driven by climate stress. In North America, the Clovis culture either disappeared or transformed so dramatically that archaeologists can't trace clear continuity. New cultural traditions emerged, adapted to the new conditions. The archaeological record shows changes in tool technology, hunting strategies, and settlement patterns. People were adapting, but at a cost. Then, 11,600 years ago, just as suddenly as it had begun, the Younger Dryas ended. Temperatures shot up again, even faster than they had fallen. Ice cores from Greenland show the transition happening over just a few decades. Some evidence suggests it might have been even faster. The warming resumed, but intensified. The ice sheets, which had paused, or even slightly advanced during the Younger Dryas, now began collapsing at an accelerated rate. And this is where our story really begins, because the ice that had accumulated during the Younger Dryas, combined with all the ice that had been building up throughout the last glacial period, was now primed to release catastrophic amounts of meltwater. The Laurentide ice sheet, the Cordilleran ice sheet in western North America, the Fennoscandian ice sheet in northern Europe, all of them were melting faster than at any time in the previous 10,000 years. The world was about to experience flooding on a scale that defies imagination. Flooding that would reshape coastlines, drown entire landscapes, and leave memories so traumatic they would echo through human cultures for millennia. The Younger Dryas had set the stage for the catastrophe that was coming. It had created the conditions, both glaciological and cultural, that would make the next few centuries the most dramatic transformation in human history since the bottleneck nearly 1 million years ago. Your ancestors, who had just survived 1,300 years of renewed cold, were about to face something even more challenging. Not cold, but water. More water than they could possibly imagine. Water that would transform their world and change the course of human civilization forever. Then, around 11,700 years ago, something changed. And when I say changed, I mean the world essentially flipped a switch from Ice Age to the climate we know today. Not gradually, not over thousands of years. In geological terms, it happened overnight. The Younger Dryas, that 1,000-year return to Ice Age conditions, was ending. But it didn't fade away gently, it collapsed. The temperature records from ice cores in Greenland show something almost unbelievable. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere increased by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Some regions warmed even faster. In parts of Europe, temperatures jumped 20 degrees in maybe 3 years. Think about what that means. Your grandparents would have told stories about winters so cold the sea froze solid. You're watching those same seas turn to open water. Glaciers your people had lived beside for generations, treating them as permanent features of the landscape like mountains, were visibly shrinking week by week. The world your ancestors had adapted to for a millennium was melting around them. But here's where the story gets truly catastrophic. Because those ice sheets weren't just sitting on solid ground. For thousands of years they'd been acting as dams, massive walls of ice, sometimes miles thick, holding back volumes of water that would make modern engineers weep. These weren't just lakes, these were inland seas trapped behind ice, waiting. The biggest was Lake Agassiz, and when I say biggest, I need you to understand the scale we're talking about. This glacial lake covered more area than all 5 modern Great Lakes combined. At its maximum extent, Lake Agassiz stretched across what is now Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Minnesota. It contained more water than all current freshwater lakes on Earth put together. The lake was more than 700 feet deep in some places. Its shores would have seemed like ocean coastlines to anyone standing on them. Endless water stretching to the horizon. For thousands of years, Lake Agassiz had been contained by the Laurentide ice sheet, a wall of ice that covered most of Canada and reached down into the northern United States. This ice sheet was up to 2 miles thick in places, 2 miles of solid ice. But as the Younger Dryas ended and temperatures spiked, that wall started to crack. Now, ice dams don't fail gently. They don't gradually erode over centuries. They fail catastrophically, suddenly, violently. What happens is this. As the ice warms, it becomes less stable. Cracks form. Water begins seeping through and under the ice. That water is warmer than the ice, so it melts its way through, creating channels. Those channels get bigger, More water flows through, more melting happens. It's a runaway process. Then, without warning, the entire structure fails. Millions, maybe billions of tons of ice suddenly give way, and all that water, all that unimaginable volume that's been patiently waiting behind the ice for centuries, it all goes at once. The geological evidence suggests Lake Agassiz drained catastrophically multiple times as different sections of the ice dam failed. But the flood around 11,700 years ago, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, that one was special. That one might have released enough water to raise global sea levels by several feet in a matter of weeks. Try to imagine the scene. You're living somewhere along what would become the St. Lawrence River Valley. It's been a decent river, reliable, something you can ford in the right places. Then one morning you hear something, a distant roar, like thunder, but it doesn't stop. It gets louder and louder. By the time you see the wall of water, there's nowhere to run. The flood wouldn't have been just water. It would have been carrying icebergs the size of buildings, boulders weighing hundreds of tons, entire forests ripped up and swept along. The force of the current would have been equivalent to hundreds of Amazon rivers flowing simultaneously. The largest river on Earth today, magnified beyond comprehension, and then multiply that by hundreds. This torrent scoured channels through solid bedrock. It carved canyons in days that would normally take millennia to form. It swept clean entire valleys, removing every trace of soil and vegetation down to bare rock. When it hit the Atlantic Ocean, it created what researchers call a freshwater lid, a layer of cold, fresh meltwater floating on top of the denser saltwater, disrupting ocean circulation patterns across the entire North Atlantic. But Lake Agassiz wasn't alone. Across the northern hemisphere, similar disasters were unfolding almost simultaneously. In northern Europe, the Baltic ice lake was approaching its breaking point. This massive body of fresh water had been trapped between the retreating Scandinavian ice sheet and the rising land around it. At its peak, the Baltic ice lake was about 30 feet higher than the modern Baltic Sea, held back by ice dams in what is now Sweden and Denmark. When those dams failed around 11,600 years ago, the flood was apocalyptic. Billions of gallons of frigid meltwater exploded through the gaps, carving channels that still exist today as straits connecting the Baltic to the North Sea. The wave that hit the North Sea coast would have been visible from miles away, a moving wall of white water carrying ice, debris, and everything else in its path. Anyone living on the coastal plains that are now submerged under the North Sea, and we know people were living there because we've found their artifacts in fishing nets, those populations would have had no warning and no chance. The flood would have moved faster than anyone could run, sweeping across flat terrain at highway speeds. And these weren't isolated events. Similar outburst floods were happening everywhere ice sheets were collapsing. In Siberia, massive glacial lakes were catastrophically draining into the Arctic Ocean. In the Himalayas, ice dams were failing and sending massive floods down into the valleys below. In South America, Patagonian ice sheets were releasing their meltwater into the Pacific and Atlantic. The entire planet was experiencing coordinated catastrophe. The geological evidence for these floods is overwhelming and unmistakable. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, there's a region called the Channeled Scablands. It's one of the most bizarre landscapes on Earth. Thousands of square miles of terrain that looks like it's been blasted by a gigantic pressure washer. Channels hundreds of feet deep carved through solid basalt. Giant ripples in the bedrock, like the ripples you see in sand on a beach, except these are 50 feet tall and made of solid stone. House-sized boulders scattered across the landscape like pebbles. For decades, geologists couldn't explain the Scablands. The conventional wisdom said landscapes formed gradually, through slow erosion over millions of years. But one geologist, J. Harlan Bretz, looked at the evidence and said, no, this was made by the biggest flood in human history. He was ridiculed, dismissed as a catastrophist, someone who believed in biblical floods rather than proper science. But he was right. We now know the channeled scablands were carved by repeated catastrophic floods from another glacial lake called Glacial Lake Missoula. This lake formed in what is now Montana, dammed by a lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet. When the ice dam failed, and it failed repeatedly over thousands of years, it released floods that are almost impossible to comprehend. Water moving at 65 miles per hour, waves 400 feet tall, flow rates that exceeded the combined flow of every river on Earth today by a factor of 10. These floods happened over and over as the ice dam reformed and failed again. Each time they scoured the landscape, moving billions of tons of rock and soil. They created temporary waterfalls that dwarfed Niagara Falls. They carved the Columbia River Gorge. They deposited massive gravel bars that became the foundation for modern cities. And they left scars that are still visible from space today. But the floods did more than just reshape the land. They fundamentally altered the ocean itself. Each catastrophic outburst released enormous volumes of cold, fresh water into the seas. This fresh water was less dense than salt water, so it floated on top, creating a lid that prevented normal ocean mixing. This disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt that moves heat from the equator to the poles and back again. Some scientists think these massive freshwater pulses might have actually triggered brief returns to cold conditions, interrupting the warming trend as ocean circulation temporarily shut down. It's a feedback loop. Warming melts ice. Melting ice releases fresh water. Fresh water disrupts ocean circulation. Ocean circulation changes can cause regional cooling. Cooling can temporarily slow the melting. Then warming resumes and the cycle repeats. The ice cores from Greenland show exactly this kind of pattern. Rapid warming, then brief cold snaps, then resumed warming. It's not a smooth transition from Ice Age to modern climate. It's chaotic, violent, punctuated by catastrophes that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone experiencing them. And the melting wasn't just happening in dramatic floods. Between the massive outburst events, the ice sheets were steadily, relentlessly disintegrating. Every summer, a little more melting. Every year, the ice retreating a little farther north. The sea level wasn't just rising from the floods. It was rising continuously as billions of tons of ice turned to water. Over the span of about 1,000 years, from roughly 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, sea levels rose approximately 40 feet. That's nearly half an inch per year on average. But the rise wasn't steady. It came in pulses. Periods of rapid increase when major ice dams failed, followed by slower rise as the ice sheets gradually melted. Then another dam would fail, and the seas would jump again. For coastal populations, and remember that coastal areas were prime real estate for hunter-gatherers because of the abundant marine resources, this was catastrophic. Imagine living on a beach. Your camp set back what seems like a safe distance from the high tide line. You've been there for generations, your ancestors' graves are there, your knowledge of the local area, where to find fish and shellfish, where the good hunting is, that knowledge has been built up over centuries. Then the sea starts rising, not all at once, gradually, but relentlessly. Year after year, the high tide line creeps closer. Eventually you have to move. You find a new campsite farther inland. You settle in. Your children are born there. Then the sea catches up again. You move again. This happens over and over, an entire way of life, constantly retreating from the advancing ocean. Some regions lost thousands of square miles of coastal plain. The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia, the route that had allowed humans to first enter the Americas, was steadily drowning. Within a few thousand years, it would be gone entirely, submerged under the Bering Strait. The British Isles, which had been connected to continental Europe throughout the Ice Age, were becoming islands as the North Sea expanded and the English Channel opened. The Mediterranean was transforming too. During the Ice Age, it had been significantly lower, with large coastal plains now underwater. As the Atlantic poured in through the Strait of Gibraltar and meltwater from the Alps added volume, these plains disappeared. Entire ecosystems, complete with the people who depended on them, were erased by rising water. And here's something that haunts archaeologists. We know some of the best real estate during the Ice Age. The places with the most resources and the most favourable climates were on these coastal plains that are now deep underwater. The most important archaeological sites from this period, the places where humans might have made their greatest innovations, developed their most complex societies, are gone, drowned under hundreds of feet of seawater. We're trying to understand human history with most of the evidence permanently submerged. The floods and the rising seas forced massive population movements. People couldn't just stay where they were. They had to adapt or die. Some moved inland, following the retreating ice and colonizing newly exposed lands. Others moved up into mountain valleys that had previously been locked in permafrost. Still others concentrated around remaining water sources, rivers and lakes that weren't actively trying to drown them. This compression and mixing of populations, previously isolated groups suddenly forced into the same territories, would have enormous consequences for human cultural evolution. But that's a story for later. For now, the world was still melting, still transforming, still punishing anyone who couldn't adapt quickly enough. The great ice sheets that had defined the planet for 100,000 years were in retreat, and the water they released, whether in catastrophic floods or gradual relentless rise, was remaking the face of the earth. When the melting finally stabilized, thousands of years later, the world would be unrecognizable. Coastlines would be completely different. Entire landscapes would be new, and humanity would be changed forever. But here's where the story shifts from slow, grinding climate change to something much more dramatic, much more terrifying, because what happened next wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic. Around 11,300 years ago, something went terribly wrong with the ice sheets, or maybe terribly right, depending on your perspective. Either way, the result was the same. The oceans rose, not slowly, not gradually, but in a geological eye blink that would reshape the entire world. This is what scientists call meltwater pulse 1b. And if that sounds like a boring technical term, let me tell you what it actually meant. It meant 15 to 25 meters of sea level rise in less than 500 years. That's 50 to 80 feet of vertical ocean rise in 5 centuries. Some researchers think it might have happened even faster, maybe as little as 200 years, maybe less. Think about that for a second. Imagine standing on a beach and watching the waterline creep up the shore. Not over your lifetime, but over generations. Your great-great-great-grandfather fishes from a beach. Your grandfather fishes from a spot half a mile inland from where that beach used to be. You fish from what was once a hilltop, and your grandchildren will fish from waters that covered the valley where your village once stood. Except it wasn't even that gradual. Because here's the thing about meltwater pulses. They don't happen smoothly. Ice sheets don't melt like ice cubes as a glass of water, slowly and evenly. They collapse. They fracture. Enormous sections break away and slide into the ocean, displacing massive volumes of water instantly. Ice dams that have held back glacial lakes for thousands of years suddenly fail, releasing floods that can raise global sea levels in a matter of weeks. So you're not watching a gradual creep. You're watching your world drown. One generation lives in a coastal valley. The next generation watches that valley become a lagoon. The one after that remembers stories about the drowned lands, about the good fishing grounds that now lie beneath 100 feet of water, about the ancestors who fled inland as the sea swallowed everything they'd ever known. Let's start with what was lost. Because before Meltwater Pulse 1b, the world's coastlines looked nothing like they do today. Sea levels were still lower than modern levels, and enormous stretches of what we now call continental shelf were dry land. Productive, fertile, resource-rich land where humans had been living for thousands of years. Take Doggerland. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. That's because Doggerland doesn't exist anymore. It's been underwater for 11,000 years. But before the Pulse, Doggerland was one of the richest territories in Europe. It was a vast plain connecting what we now call Britain to continental Europe. Not a narrow land bridge, but a huge expanse of rolling hills, river valleys, and wetlands. Bigger than many modern European countries. Archaeological evidence dredged up from the North Sea floor tells us Doggerland was paradise for hunter-gatherers. Massive herds of deer, aurochs, and wild horses migrated across its grasslands. Its rivers teemed with salmon and sturgeon. Its marshlands hosted millions of migratory birds. And its coastline, protected from the rough Atlantic by what would become the British Isles, provided some of the most productive fishing grounds in the ancient world. People lived there, not just a few scattered bands, but thriving communities. They built settlements, developed trade networks, created art. They probably had names for the rivers and mountains of their homeland. They definitely had stories about the landscape, myths about how it was created, legends about the ancestors who first walked its hills. Then the water came, not all at once, but fast enough. Within a few generations, the southern portions of Doggerland were flooding. River valleys became estuaries. Coastal plains became tidal flats. Hills became islands. The people who lived there had to make impossible choices. Stay and adapt to an ever-shrinking territory, or migrate to higher ground and compete with groups already living there. Some stayed too long. Archaeological sites from the final phases of Doggerland show evidence of increasingly desperate conditions. Settlements built on artificial mounds to stay above rising waters. Populations concentrated in smaller and smaller areas as the sea closed in. Then silence. The archaeological record from Doggerland just stops. Because by 8,000 years ago it was completely submerged. Britain had become an island, Europe had lost one of its richest territories, and thousands of years of human history had been erased beneath the waves. But Doggerland was just the beginning. The same thing was happening worldwide. Everywhere ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, and everywhere sea levels rose, coastal populations faced catastrophe. On the other side of the world, Beringia was drowning. This was the land bridge connecting Asia and North America, the route the first Americans had used to reach the New World. Before the Pulse, Beringia wasn't a bridge. It was a subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide at its broadest point, stretching from Siberia to Alaska, encompassing vast grasslands that supported mammoths, bison, horses, and the humans who hunted them. Genetic and archaeological evidence tells us Beringia had been inhabited for millennia. Some researchers think populations might have lived there continuously for over 10,000 years, isolated by ice sheets to the south and harsh tundra to the north. They were developing their own distinct cultures, their own technologies, maybe even their own languages. Their meltwater pulse 1b turned Beringia into the Bering Strait. The grasslands became seafloor. The river valleys became submarine canyons. The populations that had called Beringia home for hundreds of generations were forced to choose. Move west into Asia, or east into North America. Either way, they were abandoning the only homeland they'd ever known. And those who went east, they carried with them the memory of a lost land, the knowledge that their ancestors had come from a place that no longer existed, a place that had been swallowed by rising waters. Sound familiar? Meanwhile, in the Middle East, something even more dramatic was happening. The Persian Gulf was filling. Before the pulse, the Gulf wasn't a gulf, it was a river valley. A massive river system drained the mountains of Iran and flowed through what is now the Gulf floor, creating one of the most fertile floodplains in the ancient world. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary because it's all underwater now, but what little we've found suggests this valley supported substantial human populations. The climate was less arid than today. Rainfall from the monsoons reached further north. The river provided reliable water year-round. The floodplain renewed itself annually with fresh silt, making it incredibly productive for wild plant resources. This might have been one of the best places to live in the ancient world, protected from the worst of the Ice Age cold by mountains to the north and east. Blessed with reliable water, in a region where water meant everything. Rich in both riverine and soon-to-be coastal resources. If you were a hunter-gatherer looking for prime real estate 12,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf Valley would have been at the top of your list. Then the ocean arrived. Meltwater Pulse 1b sent sea levels surging. The narrow strait at the Gulf's mouth was breached. Salt water poured into the valley. Within perhaps a century, possibly less, hundreds of miles of river valley had become seafloor. Everything the inhabitants had built was lost. Every settlement, every resource base, every sacred site gone beneath the waves. The survivors fled, north into Mesopotamia, east into Iran, west into Arabia. They carried with them the memory of paradise lost, the knowledge that they had once lived in a land of abundance before the waters came and destroyed everything. And here's where it gets really interesting, because some researchers think this flood, the drowning of the Persian Gulf, might be the historical basis for the Noah's Ark story and similar flood myths from that region. Think about it. A massive flood that destroys civilization. Survivors who flee to higher ground carrying the seeds and animals they need to start over. The memory of a world before the flood, preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years until it's finally written down. We'll come back to this connection later. But for now, just sit with the possibility that some of our oldest stories might be based on real events, real catastrophes that our ancestors witnessed and remembered. But wait, there's more. Because the most controversial flood hypothesis connects to a body of water you've definitely heard of, the Black Sea. Today, the Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean by the narrow Bosphorus Strait. But before Meltwater Pulse 1b, the Black Sea was isolated. It was a freshwater lake, sitting hundreds of feet below the level of the Mediterranean, sustained by rivers flowing from the north. Two geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed something radical in the 1990s. They suggested that around 7,600 years ago, as sea levels continued rising from the Great Melt, the Mediterranean finally breached the Bosphorus, not gradually but catastrophically. They calculated that water would have poured through at 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. The Black Sea would have risen 6 inches per day. Coastal settlements would have been inundated almost instantly. The hypothesis is controversial. Some evidence supports it. Underwater archaeology has found ancient shorelines far below current Black Sea levels. Core samples show a sudden transition from freshwater to saltwater species. Ancient beaches with human artifacts lie hundreds of feet below the surface. But other researchers argue the flooding was more gradual, that Ryan and Pittman overstated the catastrophic nature of the event. Either way, something dramatic happened. The Black Sea changed fundamentally, and the people living on its shores had to adapt or flee. If Ryan and Pittman are right, if the flood really was as sudden and catastrophic as they claim, then we're talking about one of the most significant disasters in prehistoric human history. An event that would have displaced hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed countless settlements, and created the mother of all flood stories. But here's what we know for certain. Regardless of the specific timing and mechanism, Meltwater Pulse 1b fundamentally reshaped human geography. The most productive lands, the places where humans had been concentrating for thousands of years, were the coastal plains and river valleys, low-lying, well-watered, rich in resources. These were exactly the places that flooded first and most completely. Modern research using submarine archaeology and offshore core sampling is revealing just how much was lost. Off the coast of nearly every continent, archaeologists are finding evidence of human occupation on what is now the continental shelf. Stone tools, shell middens, sometimes even structural remains, all of it sitting beneath 150 to 300 feet of water. This means we're missing vast chunks of human prehistory. The story we tell about the development of human civilization is based almost entirely on inland sites, mountain caves, desert oases, river valleys that were far enough above sea level to avoid inundation. But the really interesting stuff, the places where populations were densest and cultural innovation was happening fastest, those places are underwater, and they've been underwater for 11,000 years. Some researchers estimate that we've lost archaeological evidence of perhaps half the human populations living at the end of the Ice Age. Half. Everything they built, everywhere they lived, every innovation they developed in the millennia before the flood. It's all on the seafloor, covered by silt, broken apart by currents, mostly inaccessible to investigation. But the impact wasn't just archaeological, it was fundamentally demographic. Meltwater Pulse 1b forced the largest involuntary human migration in history. Coastal populations worldwide had to move, not over thousands of years, but over generations, possibly within a single human lifetime in some places. Where did they go? Inland, obviously. But inland territories were already occupied by groups that had been living there for just as long. Groups that weren't particularly interested in sharing resources with climate refugees flooding in from the drowning coast. This created conflict, competition, pressure that would force humans to develop new survival strategies, new technologies, new forms of social organization. And that pressure, that desperate need to adapt to a world that had been fundamentally transformed by rising water, that might have been exactly the kick humanity needed to develop something unprecedented, something that would change our species forever. Now, you might be wondering how we know any of this actually happened. After all, we're talking about events 12,000 years ago. No written records, no photographs, no eyewitness accounts, a except for stories passed down through generations of oral tradition, how can we be sure that massive floods really reshaped the world at the end of the Ice Age? The answer lies in the landscape itself. Because when water moves on the scale we're talking about, it doesn't just wash things away. It carves, it sculpts, it leaves signatures in the bedrock that persist for millennia. And nowhere are those signatures more dramatic than in a place called the channeled scablands of eastern Washington state. Picture this. It's 1923. A geologist named J. Harlan Bretz is driving through the high desert country of eastern Washington, and what he's seeing doesn't make any sense. The landscape looks like it's been attacked by a giant with a bulldozer. Massive gouges carved into solid basalt bedrock. Channels hundreds of feet deep cutting through plateaus. Dry waterfalls that dwarf Niagara. Enormous potholes drilled into rock by spinning vortices of something powerful enough to bore through stone. And boulders. Not just any boulders. House-sized chunks of granite weighing hundreds of tons, scattered across the landscape like toys left behind by a careless child. Except there's no granite anywhere nearby. The nearest source is in the mountains of Montana and Idaho, hundreds of miles away. Bretz was a careful scientist, trained in the uniformitarian principles that dominated geology at the time. Uniformitarianism held that all geological features were created by slow, gradual processes operating over vast periods of time, the same processes we see today: erosion, deposition, uplift, weathering, acting steadily over millions of years. But what Bretz was looking at couldn't have been created by gradual processes. The scale was all wrong. The features were too sharp, too fresh, too catastrophic. He spent years mapping the scablands, documenting the bizarre erosion patterns, measuring the channels, studying the strange depositional features, and everywhere he looked, the evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. This landscape had been carved not by rivers slowly wearing away rock over millions of years, but by a catastrophic flood of unimaginable proportions. A single event, or maybe a series of events, during which more water than exists in all the rivers of the world combined, had ripped across this landscape at highway speeds. In 1923, Bretz presented his findings to the Geological Society of Washington, D.C. He called his hypothesis the Spokane Flood, a massive deluge that had scoured the scablands clean in a matter of days, maybe hours. The response was immediate and brutal. The scientific establishment rejected his ideas almost unanimously. Catastrophism, the idea that sudden dramatic events shape the Earth's geology, had been thoroughly discredited in the 19th century. It smacked of biblical flood stories and unscientific thinking. Real geology was about slow processes, not wild speculation about impossible floods. For decades, Bretz fought a lonely battle against the entire geological community. He kept mapping, kept measuring, kept documenting features that made no sense under uniformitarian principles. He found giant ripple marks, undulating patterns in the landscape that looked exactly like the ripples you see in sand at the beach, except these were 50 feet tall and hundreds of yards from crest to crest. The kind of ripples that could only be formed by moving water so deep and so fast that it defied imagination. He documented dry cataracts, places where waterfalls 400 feet tall had once thundered, carrying more water than all of Earth's current rivers combined. He traced the path of the flood waters from their source in Montana, where an ice dam had held back a lake containing more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, through the channels they'd carved across Idaho and Washington, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And slowly, very slowly, the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. In the 1940s, aerial photography revealed patterns that were invisible from the ground. The scablands, seen from above, looked exactly like a massive river delta, except it was carved into solid rock and covered an area the size of Connecticut. In the 1950s, geologists studying the valley where Lake Missoula had been found, shoreline marks indicating the lake had filled and emptied repeatedly, not once, but dozens of times. Each time the ice dam formed and held back water for years or decades, until the lake grew large enough that the water pressure shattered the ice. Each time releasing a flood that made the Mississippi look like a garden hose. By the 1960s, radiocarbon dating confirmed that the last of these floods had occurred between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, right at the end of the Ice Age, right when we know massive climate changes were reshaping the planet. In 1979, at age 96, J. Harlan Bretz received the Penrose Medal, geology's highest honour. The award citation acknowledged what had been obvious for decades. He'd been right all along. The channel scablands were indeed created by catastrophic flooding on a scale that defied comprehension. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because once geologists accepted that megafloods were real, they started seeing evidence of them everywhere. In Siberia, researchers found landscapes eerily similar to the scablands. Massive erosion features carved into bedrock. Boulder fields transported hundreds of miles from their source, channels that could only have been created by stupendous volumes of moving water. These Siberian floodscapes told the same story as Washington State. Massive ice-dammed lakes that periodically burst their restraints and unleashed catastrophic floods. In the Himalayas, geologists discovered evidence of enormous ancient lakes that had formed behind ice and moraine dams in high mountain valleys. When these dams failed, walls of water had raced down mountain valleys, scouring them clean and depositing debris hundreds of miles downstream. Some of these floods had been powerful enough to move boulders the size of small buildings. In the Altai Mountains of Central Asia, researchers found evidence of floods that had reached depths of 1,500 feet in some valleys. Think about that. Water half a mile deep racing through mountain canyons at speeds that probably exceeded 60 miles per hour. The erosive power would have been beyond anything in human experience. Even in places where the floods themselves left minimal traces, the sediments they deposited told tales of catastrophic events. Massive gravel deposits containing rocks from hundreds of miles away, layers of sediment showing characteristics of extremely rapid deposition, erratic boulders transported by icebergs floating in floodwaters, then dropped when the bergs melted. The geological community's acceptance of megafloods represented more than just vindication for Bretz. It represented a fundamental shift in how we understand Earth's history. The old uniformitarian principle, the idea that only slow, gradual processes shape our planet, had been too rigid. Yes, most of the time geological change is slow, but occasionally catastrophically change happens fast. And when it does, it can reshape entire continents in days or weeks. This had profound implications for understanding the end of the Ice Age. Because if megafloods happened in Washington and Siberia and the Himalayas, where else might they have occurred? What about when the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America began to collapse? What about when similar ice sheets covering Scandinavia disintegrated? What happened to all that water? The answer became clear as researchers studied more locations. Megafloods were happening everywhere. Glacial ice was melting. Not continuously, but episodically. Ice dams would form, lakes would fill, pressure would build, and then suddenly, catastrophically, the dam would fail. Billions of gallons of water, sometimes trillions, would burst free and race across whatever landscape lay downstream. These weren't gentle events. The Missoula floods that carved the Scablands moved water at estimated flow rates of 10 cubic miles per hour. That's more than all the rivers on Earth combined, concentrated in channels just a few miles wide. The water moved so fast it could pick up boulders weighing hundreds of tons and carry them like pebbles. The energy was staggering. Computer models suggest that during peak flow, the Missoula floods were dissipating energy at rates equivalent to the entire current energy consumption of human civilization. Except instead of being distributed across the globe, all that energy was concentrated in one relatively small area, ripping up bedrock, moving mountains of sediment, completely rewriting the landscape. And this was just one flood system. Similar events were happening across North America, across Eurasia, probably in South America and anywhere else. Massive ice sheets were retreating. The end of the Ice Age wasn't a gentle transition. It was a series of catastrophes, each one powerful enough to reshape regions the size of entire countries. For the humans living through this period, these floods would have been literally world-ending events. Imagine living in a valley that's been your people's home for generations. Maybe you're part of a hunting camp following mammoth herds. Maybe you've got a seasonal settlement near a reliable water source. Life isn't easy, but it's manageable. You know this land. Your ancestors knew this land. Then one day, maybe you notice the water in the river starting to rise. Not unusual. Spring floods happen, but this keeps rising and rising, and the sound from upstream is getting louder, a roar like continuous thunder. Then you see it. A wall of water as tall as a mountain, moving faster than anything you've ever seen, carrying ice chunks the size of houses, boulders, entire trees, the debris of shattered landscapes. And there's absolutely nothing you can do except run and pray you can reach high ground before the water reaches you. The flood passes in hours or days. When the water recedes, your world is gone. Every landmark you knew, buried under tons of sediment or scoured down to bedrock. Every campsite, every hunting ground, every sacred place, erased. The survivors, if there are any, have to start over in a landscape that's been completely transformed. This wasn't just geological change. This was the violent, traumatic reshaping of the world that humans inhabited. And if it happened in enough places, across enough of the inhabited world, people would remember. They would tell stories about the great floods, about the time water covered the world, about how only a few survived to repopulate the land. Which brings us to something remarkable, because humans did remember, and those memories, encoded in myth and legend and sacred stories, survived for thousands of years, waiting for modern scientists to realize they might not be just stories after all. Now here's where things get really interesting, because if you're a human living 12,000 years ago, and you've just watched your entire world get swallowed by rising water, what do? You can't write it down. There's no writing yet. You can't take photographs or make documentary films. All you can do is tell the story, and tell it again, and make damn sure your children understand what you saw, because someday, maybe, it could happen again. So they told stories. Around fires, in caves, during long winter nights when the only entertainment was the human voice. They told about the time the waters came, when the world ended and only a few survived. They told it so many times, in so many ways, that the story became embedded in human consciousness deeper than any written record. And here's the thing that makes archaeologists and historians deeply uncomfortable. Those stories survived. Not just survived, thrived. They spread across continents, adapted to new languages and cultures, but kept the same basic structure, the same terrifying core. Water came. The world ended. A few people survived by building boats or climbing mountains, and when the waters receded, they had to start civilization over from scratch. Let's start with the oldest written flood story we have. Not the Bible, that comes later. We're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 4,700 years ago. But the story itself is older, much older. Linguistic analysis suggests it was already ancient when it was first written down, passed through generations as oral tradition before anyone invented cuneiform script. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero meets an immortal man named Utnapishtim, who survived the Great Flood. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a deluge, but one god, Ea, warned Utnapishtim in a dream. He told him to build a massive boat, seal it with pitch, bring aboard his family and representatives of all living creatures. Then the storms came. Water fell from above, rose from below. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood covered everything. When it finally stopped, Utnapishtim's boat came to rest on a mountain. He sent out birds to test for dry land. First a dove, which returned, then a swallow, which also came back. Finally, a raven that didn't return, proving land existed somewhere. Sound familiar? Because 2,000 years after the Gilgamesh epic was written, Jewish scholars would compile the Torah, and in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, you get almost the exact same story. Noah gets warned by God, builds an ark, brings his family and animals aboard. Flood comes, covers the mountains, destroys all life on earth. After exactly 150 days, the waters recede. Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat. He sends out birds to test for dry land. Raven first, then doves. When the dove returns with an olive branch, he knows the world is recovering. The parallels are so specific that biblical scholars have spent centuries arguing about the relationship between these texts. Did the Genesis writers borrow from Mesopotamian tradition? Were both drawing from an even older common source? Or, and this is where it gets wild, are both stories imperfect memories of something that actually happened? Because it's not just two cultures telling the same story, it's dozens, hundreds, if you count all the variations. And the stories aren't just similar, they're eerily consistent about specific details that shouldn't matter if they were purely mythological. Travel to India. In Hindu mythology, you find Manu, the first man and great sage. The god Vishnu appears to him as a fish and warns that a great deluge is coming that will destroy all life. Vishnu instructs Manu to build a massive boat and take aboard the 7 great sages and seeds of all plants. The flood comes, waters cover the earth. Manu's boat is pulled by Vishnu in. His fish form to a mountaintop where they wait for the waters to recede. From Manu descends all future humanity. The core elements are there again. Divine warning, boat, survivors, mountain refuge, restart of civilization. This isn't borrowing from Mesopotamian sources. Hindu mythology developed independently, separated by thousands of miles and different languages. Yet the story persists. Go to China. In Chinese mythology, during the reign of the legendary Emperor Yao around 4,200 years ago, a catastrophic flood covered the land for generations. The first hero, Gun, tried to dam and dike the waters but failed. His son Yu succeeded by dredging channels and creating pathways for the waters to drain into the sea. Yu's flood control efforts took 13 years and established him as a founding figure of Chinese civilization. The Zhou dynasty and later imperial dynasties traced their legitimacy back to use heroic management of the deluge. What's fascinating about the Chinese version is its different emphasis. Instead of divine judgment and miraculous survival, it focuses on engineering and persistence, human effort defeating natural catastrophe. But the catastrophe itself, waters covering the earth for a generation, requiring massive societal reorganization to overcome, that core remains consistent. Travel to the Americas. Among Pacific Northwest tribes, dozens of flood traditions exist with remarkable similarities. The Cowichan people of Vancouver Island tell of a great flood when the world was young. Waters rose so high they covered all but the highest mountain peaks. People who survived tied their canoes to mountaintops and waited for the waters to recede. When they came down, they found the landscape completely transformed. Rivers ran in new channels. Islands had appeared where none existed before. The world they returned to was different from the one the flood had taken. The Nisqually, Squaxin, and other Puget Sound tribes tell similar stories. A time of great waters when only those who reached the mountains survived. The Haida people of the Pacific coast describe whole villages swept away, landscapes rearranged, only those who made it to high ground living to tell about it. What makes these stories particularly interesting is their geographic specificity. They don't describe a generic world-ending flood. They describe the actual geological features of the Pacific Northwest, the mountain refuges, the transformed river valleys, the new islands, almost like they're describing actual landscapes changed by actual water events. Aboriginal Australians have been living on their continent for at least 65,000 years. That's a staggering depth of cultural memory. And threaded through their Dreamtime stories are dozens of accounts of rising seas, drowning coastal lands, people fleeing inland from waters that never receded. Along the coast of Queensland, stories describe how the ocean once was much farther away, how people walked to islands that now require boats, how the ancestors watched the sea advance year by year, generation by generation, swallowing the world they knew. In South Australia, the Ngarrindjeri people tell of Ngurunderi, an ancestral hero who pursued his wives down the Murray River as waters rose behind him. The rising sea eventually created the islands and channels of what's now the Murray River mouth. Linguistic analysis of these stories suggests they describe events that occurred between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, right in the time frame of post-glacial sea level rise and meltwater pulses. Some researchers have even argued that specific Aboriginal stories accurately describe coastal features that have been underwater for 7,000 years. Stories passed down for 300 generations, maintaining geographic accuracy through purely oral tradition. If true, these would be the oldest accurate oral histories in human existence. Then there's the story that's haunted Western imagination for 2,400 years. Atlantis. Plato described it in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, advanced, prosperous, mighty. Then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, the island sank beneath the waves, destroyed by earthquakes and floods as punishment for the inhabitants' hubris. For centuries, scholars have argued about Atlantis. Pure fiction, garbled memory of Minoan Crete destroyed by volcanic eruption, or something else. Because Plato claimed his story came from Egyptian priests who said it happened 9,000 years before Plato's time, that would place the Atlantis catastrophe around 11,400 years ago, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas termination, right when massive floods and rapid sea level rise were reshaping coastlines worldwide. Could Plato's story be a distant, distorted memory of real civilizations drowned by rising seas? Coastal settlements swallowed as meltwater pulses raised ocean levels? Islands that literally did sink beneath the waves as post-glacial flooding inundated continental shelves? We don't know. We can't know for certain, but the timing is provocative. Which brings us to the big question that divides researchers into hostile camps. Are these flood myths memories of actual events? Or are they universal archetypes, psychological patterns that emerge independently in every culture because floods are common and terrifying? The archetype camp has strong arguments. Floods happen everywhere. River flooding, coastal storms, tsunamis. Every culture experiences catastrophic water events, so every culture develops stories about them. The similar structures, divine warnings, boat-building survivors, moral lessons about human pride and divine power, these reflect universal human psychology, not shared historical memory. Carl Jung would have said flood myths emerge from the collective unconscious, universal symbols that transcend culture because they reflect fundamental human experiences and anxieties. Water as chaos, the boat as salvation, the mountain as refuge. These are archetypal images that resonate across cultures because they touch something deep in human consciousness. And there's truth to this. Not every flood story can be a memory of the post-glacial meltwater pulses. Some are clearly localized, describing regional events or purely mythological scenarios with no geological basis. But the memory camp has its own compelling evidence, because here's what makes the ancient flood stories different from other universal myths. The myths about creation, about death and rebirth, about heroes and monsters, these vary wildly between cultures. Different details, different structures, different meanings. But flood myths, they show remarkable consistency, not just in theme, but in specific details. The birds sent to test for land, the mountaintop refuge, the idea of waters covering the highest peaks, the sense that this was a world-ending, civilization-destroying event, not just a local disaster. And the timing. When you map the distribution of flood myths and try to date their origins through linguistic analysis, many of them point back to the same rough time frame, between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. The exact period of post-glacial flooding, meltwater pulses, and rapid sea level rise. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that specific mythological details match specific geological events. The Mesopotamian myths, with their emphasis on waters rising from below and falling from above simultaneously, potentially describing the catastrophic flooding when glacial meltwater burst through the Bosphorus and transformed a freshwater lake into the Black Sea around 7,600 years ago. Underwater archaeology has found drowned settlements around the Black Sea coast that match this time frame. The Pacific Northwest myths describing mountains emerging from water could be recording memories of volcanic islands forming during post-glacial volcanic activity, or coastal mountains that had been offshore islands during glacial periods when sea levels were lower. The Aboriginal Australian stories has been the most extensively studied for historical accuracy. Researchers have correlated specific mythological accounts with specific drowned landscapes, finding remarkable matches between story details and underwater topography. If these correlations hold up, they prove that human oral tradition can preserve accurate geographic information for at least 10,000 years. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from what scientists call consilience, when multiple independent lines of evidence point to the same conclusion. We have geological evidence of catastrophic post-glacial flooding, between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. We have archaeological evidence of human settlements that were drowned during this period, and we have worldwide mythological traditions describing exactly this kind of event, with origins that date back to exactly this time frame. That's a lot of coincidences, maybe too many. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Not every flood myth records an actual event. Some are certainly archetypes, psychological patterns, or memories of more recent local floods, but some, particularly the oldest and most widespread, might actually be humanity's first history books. Oral records of the greatest natural disaster our species witnessed, preserved through story because story was the only preservation technology available. If that's true, if even some of these myths are memories of the post-glacial floods, then we need to radically revise our understanding of oral tradition and cultural memory. We've assumed that history only extends back as far as writing, about 5,000 years. But if myths can preserve accurate information for 10,000 or 12,000 years, then we've barely scratched the surface of human historical memory. Every fireside story, every ancient song, every myth we dismissed as pure fantasy might contain kernels of actual events, witnessed by actual people, preserved with remarkable fidelity through thousands of generations. The water came, the world changed, the survivors remembered, and they made damn sure we would never forget. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because when those ice sheets collapsed and the oceans rose, they didn't just reshape the geography of the planet, they reshaped human destiny itself. Picture this. For thousands of years during the coldest part of the Ice Age, humans had been living on coastlines that are now underwater, and not just living there, thriving. The best real estate on Ice Age Earth wasn't in the mountains or deep inland. It was along the coasts. Extended continental shelves exposed by lower sea levels created enormous new territories, fertile plains that stretched for miles beyond what we now call the shoreline. Rivers flowed across these plains before emptying into oceans that were 400 feet lower than today. These river valleys were paradise for hunter-gatherers. Abundant fresh water, rich wetlands teeming with fish and waterfowl, animals congregating at reliable water sources. The archaeological evidence we've found suggests these coastal zones supported significantly higher population densities than inland areas. But we've only found fragments. Because most of the evidence, most of the settlements, most of the story, is now under 400 feet of ocean. Then the melt began. Not gradually, not gently, but in catastrophic pulses that could raise sea levels by several feet in a single year. Imagine you're living in a coastal village. Your family has occupied this territory for generations. You know every hunting ground, every fishing spot, every seasonal migration route of the herds you depend on. Then the ocean starts rising. Not slowly enough that you can adapt. Fast enough that within a human lifetime everything you know is underwater. The first floods would have been confusing. Unusual high tides, perhaps, or seasonal variations. But then it keeps coming. Year after year the water advances, salt water contaminating freshwater sources, coastal wetlands becoming open ocean, fishing grounds disappearing beneath deepening waters. The archaeological record shows evidence of rapid coastal abandonment during this period. Sites that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years suddenly show no signs of human activity. The people didn't die, they moved, they had to. And they moved inland, carrying with them whatever they could salvage of their culture, their knowledge, their history. This wasn't an orderly migration. This was a refugee crisis on a scale never seen before or since. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, forced away from the territories their ancestors had occupied for millennia, all moving inland at the same time, all competing for new territories, all desperate to find resources to replace what they'd lost. And where did they go? They went to the rivers, because here's the thing about massive ice sheets melting. All that water has to go somewhere. Yes, much of it flowed into the ocean, raising sea levels. But before it reached the ocean, it swelled every river system on the planet. The Nile flooded more extensively than it ever had before. The Tigris and Euphrates created vast wetlands across Mesopotamia. The Indus became a massive, life-giving artery flowing through what had been marginal territory. These river valleys became magnets for displaced populations. People who had lived on now-drowned coastlines found themselves concentrating in these fertile inland regions, and when you take populations that had been spread thinly across vast coastal plains and force them into narrow river valleys, something remarkable happens. Population density increases dramatically. Resources become contested. The old nomadic lifestyle, moving seasonally to follow game and wild plant harvest, becomes impossible. There are simply too many people in too small an area. Competition intensifies for every fishing spot, every hunting ground, every stand of wild grain. Under these conditions, innovation isn't just advantageous, it's essential for survival. This is where agriculture was born. Not because someone had a brilliant idea one day, not because humans suddenly became smart enough to figure out farming, but because displaced coastal populations, concentrated in river valleys by rising sea levels, were forced to find new ways to feed themselves. The traditional hunter-gatherer toolkit that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years was failing. There were too many mouths to feed, and not enough territory to support nomadic lifestyles. The earliest evidence of deliberate plant cultivation appears around 11,000 to 10,000 years ago, right in the middle of the post-flood period, right when sea levels were rising fastest, right when coastal populations would have been under maximum pressure to relocate and adapt. The locations aren't random either. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Nile Valley through the Levant into Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan, the Yellow River Valley in China. These aren't just places where agriculture happened to develop. These are the exact locations where displaced coastal populations would have concentrated when sea levels rose. And here's what's fascinating. The transition to agriculture wasn't smooth or simple. The earliest farmers were actually less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Skeletal remains show increased signs of malnutrition, disease, and dental problems. Agriculture required more work for less nutritional diversity. It tied people to specific locations, making them vulnerable to crop failures and resource depletion. So why did they do it? Because they had no choice. When you've got hundreds or thousands of people concentrated in a river valley, and the coastlines they used to live on are underwater, you can't just go back to hunting and gathering. The math doesn't work. The territory can't support that many people living off wild resources alone. You either figure out how to produce more food from less land, or you starve. Agriculture was a desperate innovation born from desperate circumstances. But it worked. Barely at first, but it worked. Wild grains that had been gathered seasonally were now deliberately planted. Animals that had been hunted were now corralled and bred selectively. Food storage became systematic, allowing populations to survive seasons when fresh resources were scarce. Within a few thousand years, fully sedentary agricultural communities had emerged. These weren't simple farming villages. They were complex settlements with specialized labor, social hierarchies, and sophisticated cultural practices. and some of them were absolutely stunning. Consider Göbekli Tepe. This site in southeastern Turkey dates back nearly 12,000 years, making it roughly contemporary with the end of the Younger Dryas and the major sea level rise events. It consists of massive stone pillars, some weighing over 15 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. These pillars were arranged in circular structures that required enormous coordinated labour to construct. But here's the wildest part. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture in that region. The people who built it were still primarily hunter-gatherers. They hadn't yet made the full transition to farming. Yet they were capable of organising labour on a massive scale, developing artistic traditions and creating what appears to be a ceremonial complex that served communities across a wide area. This suggests something profound. The cultural complexity we associate with agricultural civilizations, the ability to organize large groups, create monumental architecture, develop symbolic systems, that complexity already existed before agriculture became widespread. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if the transition to agriculture wasn't the beginning of human cultural sophistication? What if it was a response to losing something that had already existed? Remember those drowned coastlines. Remember those fertile river valleys that are now hundreds of feet underwater. What if the displaced populations who created sites like Göbekli Tepe were carrying cultural knowledge from coastal societies that had been far more developed than we realize? Societies whose greatest achievements are now beneath the waves, inaccessible to archaeology, lost except for fragments preserved in the cultural memory of their refugee descendants. We can't prove it. The evidence is underwater, buried under centuries of marine sediment. But we can look at what those refugees built after they fled inland. And what they built suggests they knew things, had developed social technologies that should not have been possible for simple hunter-gatherer bands. Within a few thousand years of the great floods, the first true cities emerged. Jericho, possibly the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, dates back nearly 11,000 years. Çatalhöyük in Turkey, with its dense urban layout and sophisticated art, emerged around 9,000 years ago. These weren't gradual developments. They appeared relatively suddenly in the archaeological record, as if someone had flipped a switch. The standard narrative says agriculture made cities possible by creating food surpluses. That's true, but it's not the whole story. Agriculture created the food surpluses, yes, but the social technologies needed to organize urban life, to manage disputes, coordinate labor, maintain complex trade networks, those had to come from somewhere. And they appeared almost immediately after displaced populations concentrated in river valleys. It's as if the social complexity needed for urban life had already been developed, as if it was being transferred, adapted, and rebuilt by people who remembered living in communities that the flood had destroyed. The genetic evidence supports this. Modern populations living in these early agricultural centres show genetic mixing patterns consistent with rapid population movements and concentration during the post-flood period. People weren't just migrating from random locations. They were coming from specific source populations, coastal populations, bringing their genes and their cultural knowledge inland. The foundation for everything that came after, for the first kingdoms and empires, for writing and mathematics, for organized religion and government, all of it was laid during this immediate post-flood period. Within 3,000 years of the Great Melt, humans went from scattered, hunter-gatherer bands to urban civilizations with monumental architecture, complex economies, and sophisticated symbolic systems. That's an evolutionary eye blink. It's too fast for gradual cultural evolution. Something accelerated the process. Something concentrated populations, intensified competition, and forced innovation at a pace never seen before in human history. That something was the flood, the drowning of the coasts, the displacement of populations who had to rebuild their world in the shadow of catastrophe. Every city that rose in Mesopotamia, every kingdom that emerged along the Nile, every agricultural civilization that developed in river valleys around the world, they were all built by the descendants of refugees. People whose ancestors had watched the oceans swallow their homes, their hunting grounds, their sacred places. People who carried memories of a world before the flood, a world that existed but could never be reclaimed. And maybe, just maybe, some of those coastal cultures that were lost beneath the waves had achieved levels of sophistication we can barely imagine. Maybe the rapid development of post-flood civilizations wasn't humans suddenly figuring everything out. Maybe it was humans desperately trying to rebuild what they'd lost. We'll never know for certain. The evidence is gone, drowned beneath 400 feet of water and thousands of years of sediment. But the possibility haunts the archaeological record. The sophisticated site plans of Çatalhöyük, the monumental architecture of Göbekli Tepe, the rapid spread of agricultural techniques across continents. They all suggest people working from knowledge that already existed, adapting and rebuilding rather than inventing from scratch. What's certain is this: the floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just change the landscape, they fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. They forced innovation, concentrated populations, and created the conditions under which agriculture, cities, and eventually everything we call civilization could emerge. We're all living in the world that flood created. Every city we inhabit, every field we cultivate, every complex social system we navigate. All of it traces back to that moment 12,000 years ago when the ice sheets collapsed and the refugees of drowned coastlines had to build something new. They succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. But the question remains, what did they lose? So here's where the story gets uncomfortably relevant. Because everything we've been talking about, the massive ice sheets collapsing, the sea levels rising hundreds of feet, the coastal populations forced to flee inland, the civilizations disrupted, the genetic bottlenecks and population migrations, all of it is happening again, right now, just in slow motion. Well, maybe not that slow. Stand on the coast of Greenland today and you can hear the ice sheet dying. Not metaphorically, literally, the sound of meltwater rivers plunging into crevasses, of glaciers carving icebergs the size of Manhattan, of ancient ice that fell as snow when your ancestors were painting caves, now turning to water and flowing into the North Atlantic. The Greenland ice sheet is losing about 280 billion tons of ice per year. Antarctica is losing even more, roughly 150 billion tons annually, and that rate is accelerating. These aren't just statistics. These are the early warning signs of exactly the kind of ice sheet collapse that triggered the floods 12,000 years ago. Now, before anyone panics, we're not talking about the same timescale. The post-glacial floods happened because ice sheets that were already unstable suddenly reached tipping points. Our ice sheets are more stable, for now, and we're not living in a world that's just coming out of an ice age. But here's the thing that keeps climate scientists awake at night. Once ice sheet collapse begins, it can accelerate faster than anyone expects. The research into abrupt climate change events, the kind that happened during the Younger Dryas and the Great Melt, has revealed something deeply unsettling. Climate doesn't always change gradually. Sometimes it flips, like a switch. Decades of slow warming can suddenly trigger changes that happen in years, not centuries. Scientists call these tipping points, thresholds beyond which the climate system reorganizes itself into a new stable state, and we're playing a dangerous game trying to figure out where those thresholds are by pushing right up against them. Take the West Antarctic ice sheet. It's grounded below sea level, sitting on bedrock that slopes backward toward the continent's interior. Warm ocean water is already flowing underneath it, melting it from below. Some glaciologists think it's already past the point of no return, that even if we stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow, the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to collapse over the next few centuries. If that happens, sea levels rise about 10 feet. Globally. Permanently. 10 feet doesn't sound like much until you realize that about 40% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of a coast. Until you consider that nearly every major city in human history has been built on a coastline or navigable river. Until you think about Bangladesh, where tens of millions of people live just a few feet above sea level, or Miami or Jakarta or Shanghai or London. The ancient floods we've been discussing displaced maybe a few million people total, scattered in small communities around the world. A 10-foot sea level rise would displace hundreds of millions, maybe a billion, and unlike our ancestors, we can't just pack up and walk to higher ground. We've built trillions of dollars of infrastructure right at sea level, roads, airports, power plants, water treatment facilities, hospitals, all of it designed for a world where the ocean stays exactly where it is. But here's what really connects us to those ancient flood survivors. It's not just about the water, it's about the speed. The ice core data from Greenland shows that during the Younger Dryas, temperatures in the North Atlantic region could shift by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in a decade. Ocean currents that had flowed in one direction for thousands of years suddenly reversed. Rainfall patterns that entire ecosystems depended on changed within a generation. Our ancestors survived because they were mobile, because they lived in small groups that could relocate when conditions changed, because they didn't have complex supply chains and just-in-time delivery systems, and cities of 10 million people that all need food and water every single day. We've built a civilization that's incredibly sophisticated, but also incredibly fragile, optimized for stability, vulnerable to disruption, and we're seeing the disruptions starting. Not at the scale of 12,000 years ago, not yet, but follow the pattern. More intense hurricanes, more severe droughts, rainfall patterns shifting so that regions that have been farmland for centuries are becoming too dry, while other regions are flooding. Wildfires burning through landscapes that haven't seen fire in thousands of years. These aren't random events. They're the early symptoms of a climate system that's being forced out of the stable state it's been in for the entire history of human civilization. Because here's something most people don't realize. All of recorded history, everything from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the space age, has happened during one of the most climatically stable periods in the last 100,000 years. The Holocene, the geological epoch we've been living in, has been remarkably consistent. Sure, there have been droughts and cold snaps and warm periods, but nothing like the wild swings that characterize the Ice Age or the transitions into and out of it. We've built our entire civilization during this period of unusual stability. Our agriculture, our cities, our trade routes, all of it assumes that climate is basically constant, that the monsoons will come at the same time each year, that rivers will flow with predictable amounts of water, that growing seasons will stay roughly the same length. But the geological record shows that the stable Holocene climate is the exception, not the rule. For most of the last million years, Earth's climate has been variable, chaotic, prone to sudden shifts. We just happened to build our civilization during the one period when things calmed down, and now we're destabilizing it again. The archaeological community is racing against time, because as sea levels rise, we're losing the evidence of our own history. Sites that could tell us how our ancestors adapted to the floods, how they migrated, what technologies they developed to survive, they're being inundated, drowned, lost forever. Doggerland, that drowned landscape between Britain and Europe that was home to thousands of people before the floods, is being scoured by North Sea currents. Every year, more artifacts are destroyed, more sites are buried under sediment or eroded away. We're trying to map it, to recover what we can with underwater archaeology, but it's like trying to excavate Pompeii while it's actively being destroyed. The same thing is happening in the Persian Gulf, where the ancient coastline is now under hundreds of feet of water, in Southeast Asia, where entire river valleys that were home to Ice Age populations are now beneath the sea in the Americas, where sites that could tell us about the peopling of the New World are submerged offshore. We're losing our history just as we're starting to understand how important it is, because that history tells us something crucial. It tells us that humans are incredibly resilient but also incredibly vulnerable. The genetic evidence shows that we've been through population bottlenecks before, that we've survived climate disasters that killed 98% of our species. But it also shows the cost. Those bottlenecks left permanent marks on our genome, reduced our genetic diversity, created vulnerabilities that we still carry today. The survivors went on to repopulate the world, but they were changed, shaped by the trauma of near extinction. And those were small populations, a few thousand people, maybe a few 100,000 at most. We're 7.8 billion now. If we face a climate disruption on the scale of what happened 12,000 years ago, the absolute numbers of people affected would be unprecedented in human history. But there's another side to this story. Those ancient survivors weren't just victims. They were innovators, adapters, problem solvers. The climate disruption that forced them to relocate and reorganize also forced them to develop new technologies, new social systems, new ways of thinking about the world. The birth of agriculture happened in the aftermath of the floods. The first cities emerged from communities that had been displaced and forced to reinvent themselves. The complex societies that would eventually develop writing, mathematics, organized religion, all of it traces back to populations that were dealing with the consequences of massive climate change. Maybe the floods didn't just change human civilization. Maybe they created it. Maybe the pressure of adapting to a rapidly changing world forced our ancestors to become more innovative, more cooperative, more capable than they had been before. If that's true, then we're facing a similar test. Not identical. We have advantages our ancestors didn't. Technology and scientific understanding and global communication networks. But we also have vulnerabilities they didn't. A planetary population that depends on stable climate systems, infrastructure that can't be easily relocated, ecosystems that we've already pushed to the brink. The question is whether we'll respond with the same resilience and innovation that our ancestors showed, or whether we'll cling to systems and assumptions that no longer match the world we're living in. The geological and archaeological evidence is clear. Climate can change faster than civilizations can adapt. Coastlines that have been stable for thousands of years can be inundated in decades. Populations that have lived in one region for generations can be forced to migrate. It's happened before. It's happening now. And unless we take seriously the lessons encoded in ice cores and flood deposits and ancient myths, It's going to happen again. Our ancestors survived because they were willing to change, to move, to abandon old ways and develop new ones. They survived because they maintained networks of cooperation even under extreme stress. They survived because some of them, not all, but enough, were willing to adapt faster than the world was changing. We carry their genes. We inherited their adaptability. The question is whether we inherited their wisdom too. So here we are, at the end of a journey that took us back 12,000 years to witness one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. A time when ice sheets the size of continents collapsed in geological instants, when sea levels rose hundreds of feet, swallowing coastlines that had been home to countless human communities, when temperatures whipsawed between extremes, turning grasslands into deserts and tundra into forests within single human lifetimes. This wasn't just another climate shift. This was the event that ended the Ice Age and fundamentally rewrote the rules of human existence. Everything that came after, agriculture, cities, writing, civilization itself, happened because of what the flood set in motion. Because here's what we sometimes forget. The world we live in today, with its relatively stable climate and abundant resources, is an anomaly. For most of human history, the planet was colder, harsher, less forgiving. The Great Flood and the warming that followed created conditions unlike anything our ancestors had experienced. And we rose to meet them. Think about it. Those survivors who watched their coastal villages vanish beneath rising seas, who felt earthquakes from collapsing ice sheets thousands of miles away, who witnessed megafloods that carved new landscapes in days, they didn't just survive. They adapted. They innovated. They created new ways of living that would eventually support populations millions of times larger than the scattered bands of their ancestors. The invention of agriculture wasn't inevitable. It was a response to specific conditions created by the flood's aftermath. Warming temperatures and changing rainfall patterns, new concentrations of wild grains in certain fertile regions, growing populations pressed together in shrinking territories as the seas claimed the old coastlands. Our ancestors didn't choose farming because it was easier than hunting and gathering. Early agriculture was brutal work. They chose it because the world had changed and they needed new strategies to survive in it. And the remarkable thing is they remembered. Across every continent, in cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years, the flood stories persisted. The Mesopotamian epics, the biblical account, the Greek myths, indigenous traditions from Australia to the Americas. Details differ, but the core narrative remains consistent. There was a great flood. The old world was destroyed. A few survivors started over. These aren't just stories. They're cultural memory, human testimony passed down across hundreds of generations. The intersection of hard scientific evidence and ancient tradition, both pointing to the same catastrophic truth. The geological record confirms what the myths remembered. The Channel Scablands, carved by floods that moved more water than all Earth's rivers combined. Ice cores preserving atmospheric changes from the Younger Dryas cold snap. Sea level markers showing the dramatic rise of the oceans. Sediment layers marking the sudden collapse of Ice Age megafauna populations. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to read it. But perhaps the most important lesson from 12,000 years ago isn't about the past, it's about the future. Because if there's one thing the Great Flood teaches us, it's this. Earth's climate can change with shocking speed, not over millions of years or even thousands, over decades, sometimes years. Those ice sheets didn't gradually melt, They collapsed catastrophically. The oceans didn't slowly creep up coastlines, they surged, and ecosystems that had existed for millennia vanished in a geological eye blink. We live on a dynamic planet, one capable of dramatic transformations that can reshape the world within a human lifetime. Our ancestors survived that reality through adaptability, innovation, and cooperation. They developed new technologies, new social structures, new ways of understanding and managing their environment. In many ways, we're still living on the momentum of choices they made in response to catastrophe. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, remember that you're part of this story. Your ancestors survived the flood, adapted to its aftermath, and created the civilizations that would eventually produce you. You carry their resilience in your genes, their survival strategies encoded in your culture. You're a descendant of people who watched their world transform and refused to give up. If you enjoyed this journey back to the flood that changed everything, leave a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating mysteries. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love hearing from viewers around the world, and if you have questions about the flood, ancient civilizations, or anything we covered tonight, leave those in the comments too. We read them all. Now rest well. Let your mind wander through those ancient landscapes. Picture the ice sheets carving into warming seas, the grasslands spreading across former tundra, the first farmers planting seeds in the fertile soil left by receding floods. It's a story of catastrophe, yes, but also of hope, resilience, and the unstoppable human drive to adapt and thrive no matter what the world throws at us. Sleep peacefully, and we'll see you in the next one.